Hey friends. Well, I had a beautiful morning. My daughter woke up shortly after me. So sometimes when that happens, she'll just sit there and color while I do yoga. She usually pesters me incessantly, but that's okay. She just needs to know that I'm responding. Um, but there's something special about my morning routine involving her, or at least being in proximity to her. It even though it can be kind of a distraction, it's definitely I wouldn't say I do my deepest yoga or my deepest meditation when she's sitting next to me. There's still something just priceless about feeling like that's something that she shares. And kind of unrelatedly, I've been reflecting a bit about something that I've heard Sadhguru say a number of times. And I guess the way into it, or the way to start my own thought process about it, is that he talks about people in nowadays, especially people in rich countries. So many of our problems are solved for us that we have degrees of freedom that are essentially unheard of in history. People have, by and large, greater degrees of freedom now than at any other point in history. Not everyone, but many people. And what that means is most privileged people in a rich Western economy, and as privileged, I would count a good chunk of the country. I'm not talking about like 1%ers. I'm talking about just by and large the upper middle class. We're not suffering our bondage. We're suffering our freedom. And what Sadhguru, the way he says that, and the reason he says that, is that, if you have heavy restrictions imposed on you, or there's like legitimate scarcity of resources required to survive or meet basic needs, right? Survival needs and just basic needs that maybe go a little bit beyond survival, but are still kind of just the general building blocks of life. If we're in that situation, then we're legitimately suffering our restrictions. What causes us suffering is the limitations, the lack of access, the lack of the constant survival kind of mode that we can get into, which we definitely see a lot of in rich economies as well. But people who grow beyond that, and especially nowadays with the level and affordability of technology, and just the general quality of life circumstances of now, our suffering does not derive from limited resources. That can only happen if we're comparing our level of resources to someone else's and wishing we had more, looking one step or several steps beyond where we are and thinking, ooh, it'll be really nice when I get that bigger house or that nicer car or that better computer or whatever. So in other words, our freedom, the sort of abundance and the richness that our life inherently contains has become a source of suffering because it's in comparison. We place it in comparison. Without that comparison, it's a whole other, we're living in the golden age. Things that royalty could never have considered, would never have known were possible. Levels of luxury. There's a really hilarious passage from a book that I want to read now. I can't even remember the author because it was quoted in another book I'm reading. I'm reading a book called How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. Oh, I can almost come up with the author's name. But anyway, it's this guy who writes a story about a man who falls asleep in the 1880s and wakes up in the year 2000. And the book was written in the 1880s. So this is a creative person's vision of what the world was going to look like 100 years later. And he said things like, people no longer go shopping. They simply place orders and things are delivered to them by pneumatic tubes. Or if he said when people, if we could find a way to pipe music into every home of perfect, of great quality, and to suit any mood or occasion, when we are able to do that, then we will have reached the pinnacle of human evolution and will no longer have a desire to reach higher. Isn't that funny? This is a man writing in the 1880s about the future. So that occurs to me as a tangent to the point I'm making, which is that, and again, this is very much coming up in my own where I am in my own grappling with stuff right now. But this notion that the suffering that I feel, the discomfort that I feel, has its roots in abundance. We're suffering our abundance, would be another way of saying it. We're not suffering our scarcity. We're suffering our abundance. And it's just good for me to remember that every once in a while. Because as I look at myself and consider what changes I need to make, or what work I need to do, what direction, I want to go, there's a kind of, it's a good reminder. It's just a good reminder. It keeps my feet on the ground, keeps me real. Because the fact is, as far as abundance goes, I've got a life that's truly spectacular, truly, truly miraculous in some ways. And it's not that I think it's important because, I mean, Seguro makes a very specific. He's always very clear about. I've heard him answer questions about when he gets questions about, well, what are people supposed to do with your guru advice when they don't have food to eat? And he basically says, well, I have programs that I run, that are volunteer, and that are truly about creating the fundamental building blocks of life: farming, agriculture, education, literacy. I think his foundation does all that. But his other answer is, right now, the people who are destroying the planet are people whose bellies are already full. So it's important for those folks, the belly full people, to look at how we live and decide what we are doing with our time and our energy and our abundance. What are we doing with it? How are we contributing? And I think part of my recent, last month or two, kind of grappling with what I sense is a pretty big transition in my life, that question comes up. That question feels pretty central. It feels like it's at the heart of it. It feels like it's right. It's like it's the best guiding principle. I mean, it's not really a principle. It's a question. And I think it's important to, what I was going to say about the belly full people. It's important not to minimize the struggle of people who are suffering their abundance. There's a lot of us. It's a real struggle. It's not something that can be wished away or sort of dismissed as just people being silly. It's an epidemic in some ways of entire cultures, entire countries of people suffering their abundance. So it's a problem that needs a diagnosis. It needs some kind of. It needs addressing, not simply by just judging all those folks out of existence, or imagining that, like, by leveraging judgment on because we assume that the problems of abundance are smaller problems than the problems of survival, but that's not really true. The problems might be the same size or bigger. They're not. My personal survival might not be at stake, but that doesn't make the problem easier to solve. And I think that's why, Sadhguru, I've seen a number of videos where he occasionally gets these questions from somebody who's like, well, what is all this spiritual mumbo jumbo about self-actualization and when people are suffering in the streets or whatever? And it's like, well, we need both. Those are both problems that need. Those are both circumstances that need positive forward steps. And I think just register for me right now. I think the reason I got that this flashed up as significant for me this morning is that recognizing where we are, recognizing what part of the picture we're in, and then therefore what the specific kind of changes are in ourselves or in our lives that will really grow us, that feels kind of key. That feels like it's a helpful starting point for forward movement. Because who wants to suffer their abundance for all their life? That doesn't sound fun. Anyway, it's ongoing. I'll have more of this tomorrow. But I appreciate you tuning in. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.